Good thing.
So good evening. I am Naomi Nova, Vice President of Special Education Equity for Kids of Connecticut, commonly known as CREC. We would like to welcome you to tonight's CREC Speaks, which will feature a discussion between Ed.D. Feinstein, myself, and representatives from 3 of Connecticut's regional education service centers, also known as RESCs. If you are wondering, what is a RESC and what services does it offer, you have come to the right place. Please allow me to introduce our guests. From Capital Region Education Council, CREC, we are joined by Greg Florio, the Executive Director, and Heather Tartaglia, Director of Student Services. From EastConn, we are joined by Eric Protulis, Executive Director. From Cooperative Education Services, CES, we are joined by Mike McGrath, Director of Special Education. So as always, we have a disclaimer. There are attorneys on this presentation, and nothing that we say is or should be considered legal advice. That's very important. CREC is a voluntary organization, and all of the people that you see on your screen today are freely giving of their time. But the organization does require money to do our job, and we strongly encourage you to go to our website, crect.com, and make a donation to help us do this vital work for our community. So without further ado, let's get started. I will start with our Chair of the Legislative Committee, Ed.D. Feinstein.
Hi, good evening. I appreciate you all being there. What was not said in the introduction was, with the exception of Heather, all of you were special ed directors or superintendents, right?
Yes.
Earlier lives?
Yes. From birth.
From the very beginning.
And Heather has come up through that system, right?
I've spent my whole career, educational career in RESCs, almost 10 years at EastConn and now 9 years at CREC.
Okay. And so you are first and foremost educators, correct?
Yes.
Correct.
So let's start with the basics. What are RESCs? Why do they exist? What do they do? And I guess we should start with Greg, who's got the largest RESC there is.
Yeah, regional education service centers were an idea that came up in the 1960s. Actually, CREC was started with an $8,000 grant through the Wethersfield Board of Education with the idea of establishing cooperative and shared services throughout a region. In 1972, we were placed into statute with the passing of a law that enabled RESCs to form. We are not-for-profit agencies. We are fee-for-service. We act as agents of our member districts. They are, in effect, our governing boards, and they control us. They manage us and oversee our operations. So the idea, going back to the origin of RESCs, was that we are agents to serve the boards in our region. And I believe when the RESC started, it was, there might have been 4 or 5 districts in a region. And over time, we have in effect become 6 regions within the state of Connecticut to serve anywhere from 25 to maybe 35 or 40 school districts within our region. As I said, it is in statute, but you made a comment, CREC serves the capital region. We have a number of urban districts. Most of our districts are larger districts or mid-sized districts, but there are also regional education service centers like EastConn that work in a very rural area. So although we are created under the same statute, we all have very different populations that we serve. So I don't know, Eric, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, a couple of things I would add is, even if you think about the origin, and certainly EastConn in particular, much of our beginnings began with servicing our districts around special education. And EastConn's history began with that, and it was in district programming. And you see over time that the needs and the requests of our district, which is really what we're responsive to for the most part, changed. And so that history of having in-district programs was sort of the model, and that was the priority. Over time, that switched to districts expanding, needing to take over spaces that we were in, looking for changes of services or asking for students to have a placement that was outside of the district, became then the model that we were asked to respond to. And as you know, we're kind of talking about this shift that's happening now with the desire to have, a balance of in-district and out-of-district programs. And I think it's important too, what Greg was talking about of our structure and our governance, that we're governed by members of our boards of education who are then appointed to our board of directors. So we have a real direct connection back to the school districts that we serve.
Let me ask, I mean, there are 6 RESCs in the state. Is every town in the state a member of a RESC?
Yes.
Yes. So when I began at CREC, there were 35 member districts in CREC, including 2 smaller districts kind of in the northwest part of CREC. And in those 2 districts actually were doing more work with Ed Advance in the Litchfield area.
Right.
And over time, we at CREC, we didn't really have to, they asked, could we move? And we said, sure. The statute allows your board to petition to work with a different RESC. So the way that it is structured, it's the board's choice to be a member of a RESC. But over time, I think there was just a natural geographic, boundaries that created the RESCs. But as recently as a few years ago, some districts have actually changed RESCs because of their connection to the services that were provided.
But I don't understand one thing. You are providing services with the Strive program down in Guilford. That's not in your region, right? And you provide help with capital construction throughout the state, outside your region, right?
We do not do the construction anymore.
Oh, good.
And one of the things that exists is we also, as 6 RESCs, have an alliance where we work together to provide services. And we'll probably get into more of each RESC has areas of strength and areas where they provide more services than maybe another RESC. And in the case of Strive, the districts approached the RESCs, and it was determined that the most effective way to operate the program would be to work with CREC. And that decision was made. I mean, Heather could add maybe a little bit to that because she works more closely with the program. But the boundaries are just boundaries. There's no statutory language that says CREC cannot provide services outside of the boundary. And again, we work cooperatively to make, to do what's best for the students across the state, in providing those services. I don't know, Heather, do you want to talk specifically about Strive?
Yeah, I think at the time that Strive was created, the transition coordinator that was working with those districts before they had a program was specifically from CREC, which is what kind of started it. And I think at the time, Learn did not have the capacity to start the program. And so one of the things we do when we're approached by work in other regions, we try really hard to check in with to ensure the districts know that they have we may be out of their RESC region, to offer them, to connect them with their RESC. But there are times, like Greg said, where one RESC will have a capacity at a given time. Many years down the road, Learn has a lot of capacity in the area of transition, but we've been running the program on behalf of the districts, and so that hasn't shifted. But that is the only actual program we operate outside of our region.
Well, just stop for a second and talk about what Strive does.
Sure. So Strive is one of CREC's 2 district-owned programs. And so it's a collaborative 18 to 22-year-old program for Clinton, Madison, and Guilford Public Schools. The program is owned by the district, and so it's overseen by the advisory board, which includes their 3 special education directors. It only takes in students from those 3 districts. It's located in Clinton. And it provides the 18 to 22-year-old services for those 3 towns when it's the appropriate placement for the students that they place with us. So the size of the program can vary depending on the number of students they have at a given time. The benefit to it for the districts is that, they're able to come together and have the program run in one of their member districts. It based on kind of the number of students they have at a given time depends on sort of where the students come from. It's located on the bus line in Clinton so that we're able to get them with 9-town transit to the different communities for job placements. And it's just a really nice collaborative model that really allows us to operate on behalf of the districts. And then in that model, the advisory board approves our budget. If there is, any kind of surplus or loss, it goes in and out of a fund balance that's owned and retained by those three districts.
Naomi, you were asking something?
I think we covered it. I was going to ask if a school could send to different RESCs.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we see that particularly in my region. I'll talk a little bit about that being where we're located, and we have, we all have different RESCs that we're contiguous with. For us, we are fairly close. Some of our towns that are just north of Norwich, they'll look to Learn and to EastConn. And then we have some of our towns that are more on the western front that will also utilize CREC programs. So we spend a lot of time trying to coordinate schedules and calendars to make sure that those districts are kind of aligned with EastConn, as well as those two, our partner RESCs at CREC and Learn, so that we try not to mess up calendars for kids. If you've got kids in district and kids out of district, it's a lot more complicated for families. But yeah, from a parent perspective, there's no issue with them looking across any boundaries.
Okay.
As far as
I've got to say that, your office is the definition of a place that you can't get there from here.
Yeah, our outplacement programs operate. We last year we had 41 different districts send us kids. So and mainly, when we talk geographic boundary, we share a border with Ed.D, and Ed.D doesn't really have a lot of opportunity for outplacement programming. So we get kids from Waterbury and New Milford. We get kids from New Fairfield, even though it's quite far from Trumbull, where the facilities are located. And then we get some kids from ACES and the region as well too, because the program isn't exactly the right program for the student. And so it's very common for us to go across the lines.
Okay, well, let me talk money for a second. Now you tax, you get a fee for each student from each town you're in.
So yeah,
If you
so
could call it that.
I'm sorry.
do you want to go ahead, Greg?
Eric, go. You can answer that one.
Yeah, so the way that works, their membership fee is $1 per student in their district.
Okay.
So for our region, we serve about 32,000 students. So I look at that as the only guaranteed dollars that EastConn receives. Everything else is fee for service or through competitive grants. That's how we're funded. But so the fee to admission to a RESC is $1 per student.
Okay, and that's not big money.
No.
No.
And it's been that rate for, I don't know, Greg, you probably have
For a long time. I mean, it's a line item. There was a point in time when there was a line item in the state of Connecticut Department of Education budget to support the RESCs. And one of the reasons that the state paid a portion of the kind of the operating budget of the RESCs was they wanted RESCs to have some flexibility to take some risks on behalf of districts, to create program, to go after a grant, to, be innovative and begin programs. But even with that, ultimately the program has to be self-sustaining for us to operate. It's not to say that the state doesn't pay us money for programs if it's a service that is requested or if it's a magnet school. But we also, we can apply for grants, governmental grants, private grants, foundation grants. But again, if you look at the bulk of the money, for example, that we receive, it's from, the state operating programs on their behalf or from our member districts.
Well, let me ask the sort of the most immediately relevant question. How dependent are you on federal funds?
Well, certainly for our early childhood programs under Head Start, and not all RESCs offer Head Start programs, but we're very concerned because we just are coming to the end of our first 5-year cycle with a grant, and we're waiting to hear the status of the grant going forward. We feel we've done an outstanding job providing the services, but that is an issue and concern. Because we are also a large magnet school operator, we do receive some title grants from the federal government, Title I, II, III, and maybe even a little Title IV. That's not a large percentage of our budget, but it's a, it still would be a significant impact to services to children if that money was not directed to us. And it doesn't come, that money doesn't come directly from the federal government. That goes through the state and then to either districts or in our case to a RESC.
Well, I see that on Heather's slide on the left. There's that dirty word equity. I mean, that you could be waving a red flag in front of them now.
Quite proudly.
You don't have to answer that. We can.
Quite proudly. Yeah, and also, Andy, in terms of the federal funding piece, for us, core service is our early childhood services. So it would have a very significant impact. And we just had Joe Courtney out today visiting our program out in Danielson to talk about it. And nobody has answers currently, but there is a lot of fear and trepidation about what's going to happen to that funding. Most of us would not be in a position to be able to sustain that without that federal funding. I don't know that the state could pick up that cost for any duration of time either, and certainly would have significant impacts on families, economic downturn, families who rely on Head Start for childcare to be able to work. It's scary to think about, but we keep.
Okay, so if there's a cut in federal funds, it would be for a specific program, and you would just have to terminate that specific program. But the rest of the operation would be unaffected. Is that?
We'd have some period of transition while we tried to keep the program alive and sought state support for that. But yeah, there's a finite time that could be sustained for any one of us.
I think it's a little bit more complicated, I think, than just either if we get the federal funds or we don't get federal funds, because certainly we do a lot of professional development, special ed, and otherwise, so the other RESCs, and money that comes through the title grants, money that sometimes comes through Perkins grants, all those pressures on a local district are going to have an impact on whether or not they can provide training to staff, whether or not they can provide different kind of supports. It's a fund of money, and if there's a strain on the fund of money or a drain on that fund of money from any particular source, it's going to have a trickle down impact on all of us, and it might lead to us not being able to provide the same amount of professional supports that we currently do.
Let me. This is obviously a broadcast that has to do with special education. So Mike and Heather, can you sort of walk us through the continuum of special ed services that are offered by the RESCs?
Absolutely. I can start and Mike can jump in if that's okay with you, Mike.
Yeah.
And so I think Eric and Greg said it earlier, but most of our foundational programs and all of the RESCs, Andy, you're going to find are where the RESCs started. So for CREC, that is River Street School in Windsor, which is a school for students that have an autism diagnosis, and Soundbridge, which is in a different iteration, but was a school that had kind of different modalities over time, but was a school for students that were deaf or hard of hearing. And so those were our foundational programs that started around 60 plus years ago. And that's evolved over time, but every RESC runs kind of what you would call a traditional outplacement program. Students are placed through the PPT process into one of our programs. Generally, all of the RESCs have programs for a variety of disabilities. Some of the RESCs run collaborative model programs, like we talked about Strive. We also run Farmington Valley Diagnostic Center, which is another similarly modeled program where it's sort of district owned. Many of the RESCs have classrooms or collaborative programs that exist within the school setting. I think most RESCs also have behavioral services or behavioral and psychological services that are out in districts providing the consultation at the school level, and hoping that's where that starts from an intervention point to try to help keep kids in district before an outplacement is considered. Those could be BCBAs going out, doctoral level psychologists, depending on which RESC it is. Mike, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, we have all those services as well. Outplacement programs for students with autism and other developmental disabilities. We have students with emotional disabilities. We do a lot of behavioral consultations. We do audiological consultations and a lot of audiological evaluations, assistive technology. We provide special ed programs, services within our magnets. You know, and beyond that piece of it, and we've been doing more and more of this lately, is doing real audits for school districts that are in our region and helping them come up with ways to keep kids in district, and then providing them with the technical support that's needed in order to make sure that LRE is, you know, really what's at the forefront of consideration.
Now, in terms of these schools, the you know, the outplacement schools that you have, and you know, Eric and I had some correspondence about this, but you know, the figures from the State Department of Education is there are about 7,500 kids who are outplaced under IEPs, and it's slightly more than half of them are in RESC programs. And I don't know whether you agree or disagree with that, but that's what Ajit says. So
yeah, it definitely is what the data says. It's interesting because it's not how we add up our number of kids, and we kind of combined our numbers, but that is definitely what's in the data report. So we're going to go with that.
That's fine, but
But I also think some of that. So for Heather, why don't you explain the way SoundBridge services work? Because
okay, yeah, please do.
But I'm just saying, so some of those students who may be in that count are probably being served, but are not at a location other than their local school.
Yeah, some of them we may hold a student contract for. So Sunbridge used to be more of a traditional outplacement program that existed actually in the public schools. And over time, more and more students have been able to be served in their home setting. So it's no longer a traditional outplacement, but we still have teachers of the deaf that contract with districts. Sometimes it's for a portion of an FTE of a teacher of the deaf going out, or audiological services. Sometimes it's for one student, but we would be doing individual contracts for those students, even though the service is being provided in district. So I don't know what that, I'd have to look more into what that data is inclusive of.
Well, we don't have to settle that. So, so you have these standalone schools, and you have, I mean, River Street and ACES has a big autism school, right? I don't know whether the CES have an autism school.
We do, yeah. We have a program for students that are
okay
in that category. It's from 4 years old up to 22, and there's about 150, 160 kids in any given time.
Okay, and you have programs for, I guess, ED kids. I mean, for serious behavioral kids. The Therapeutic Days program, which now has a new name by CES.
Yeah, the Merit Academy.
Yeah.
The Merit Academy, and you all have both of those types of schools.
Yeah, all the RESCs do.
So,
okay.
And all of the RESCs, Andy, it would also, I think all the RESCs run transition programs of one sort or another. You know, either in one of their programs or as standalone programs.
Okay.
Ed has a program as well on the post-university campus for 18 to 22-year-olds. CREC and Ed are in the process of starting a similarly modeled program on the campus of Central Connecticut State University. And so that's another area that I think all of the RESCs across the board have transition services, standalone transition services.
So can I jump in, Andy?
Yeah, I was waiting for you.
Okay, so a lot of the families that we represent who are looking at an outplacement have children who have, significant behaviors, and it can be really hard to find the right program for them. And, it's hard to keep those kids in district. And so oftentimes those kids are candidates for outplacement. One of the, big concerns that we hear from families when they're looking at, when the board is proposing a placement at a RESC is the restraint and seclusion data that comes out. And, all RESCs are a little bit different. Some RESCs have a reputation of being a little bit more aggressive with their use of restraint and seclusion than others do. But, I'm bringing this question up because the state did just release 2 years worth of data on restraint and seclusion. The numbers are quite high. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how restraint and seclusion factors into your programming, whether or not it's a necessary component to a behavioral program, and alternatives.
I think I'll start on some of that, and then Mike and Heather obviously can chime in as well. So I think it begins from the standpoint of when we bring a parent in to look at our program, we want to be transparent, and we want to talk to them about the continuum of interventions. Obviously, restraint and seclusion is not our first line of action and course when a student is having, a period of dysregulation and behavioral issues. So But it is something that we want to be transparent about when parents come in for a visit. We want to be honest, and I'll say this as the special ed director, when I was at EastConn before and I was at ACES for a couple of years, that's a part of what we need to be clear with parents about, to let them know that that is part of the resources that we utilize with the students. But it's also the communication that goes on with the family around when we use that, why we've used it, and really our efforts to make sure that we are trying to reduce that occurrence if that's occurring for a student, because you don't want to see that. I would say that I do think it's a necessary component in a continuum of interventions that we can apply. When we look at some of the behaviors and the dysregulation that students come in with, for their safety and for the safety of staff, it is a necessary component. I know there is some controversy. I know there's a lot of different points of view about it.
Eric,
But
can I just ask to clarify, do you believe that both restraint and seclusion are necessary components, or more restraint than seclusion?
Yeah, I would say both. And I do really mean this in terms of it is a continuum of interventions. And I think we also have to recognize what an individual student comes to us with in terms of their history and experience. And for some students, one or both of those may be more traumatizing and or may cause more issues for that student. But given the fact that we have the responsibility to maintain their safety, and we have to have interventions that are also providing for the safety and well-being of the staff who are there to care for the students, I have grave concerns when I see the conversation begin about the elimination of it. I don't think that it's not the first line of defense. It's not the first thing that we want to do with students, but in a continuum of care for students, it does have a place for us.
Yeah, everything that Eric said, I agree with wholeheartedly. And I would add to it is that, looking at the data in terms of just the seclusion or just the restraint, doesn't give real credit or tell the full story of all the de-escalation that has to go in prior to, and all the attempts to make sure the kids are safe in every way possible prior to the intervention, and then the teaching, the discrete instruction that goes on afterwards to try to have kids learn strategies of self-regulation, and the kinds of things that would serve them well when they're not in school, when they're in their communities, when they're in their homes. And we see over time with kids that we are able to get them to a place where the number of incidents for individual students is reduced over that period of time because of the direct instruction, the specialized instruction that goes on to try to help kids, so that they're not constantly in that place of dysregulation and possibly self-injurious.
Could you go into a little bit more detail regarding that? Because when we look at the data, it looks like the number of restraints compared to the number of students being restrained, there's a significant difference there, which seems to be consistent with the same students being the ones who are restrained over and over and over again.
Yeah, and if you look at the period through a period of time of 1 year, I can see where that would be a conclusion to draw. You'd have to look at it longitudinally for individual students in order to really see where you have that kind of a real drop down per student. We saw a big drop off in last year's numbers from the year before, and it wasn't that we were doing anything that was that much different, except that we had a bunch of kids that were new to us, younger kids, and typically we see our younger kids are the ones that require more restraints because they just don't have the skills yet. They don't have the verbal ability yet, and they don't have the dysregulation under control. So when we look at those same kids over a period of time, we're seeing that kids are being restrained less when they spend more time with us because of the instruction and the strategies, the behavioral interventions, the therapeutic interventions, and the counseling that goes along with it.
I also think, Naomi, when you look at the data over time, we also have to look at what's changed in the law and what's reported. And so, with the passage of some of the changes of the law in 2018, when forcible escorts started being reported when they weren't being reported prior, then we have 2 years of pretty skewed data in 1920 with COVID happening in March, and then many students being kind of being educated remotely in the 2021 school year. And then what did we see in 21-22? But a lot of students come back to school and into outplacements with higher levels of dysregulation than we had ever seen based on kind of the period of time they had been out of school. And I think, when you look at the number of restraints and seclusions that are occurring in LEAs outside of RESCs, during that period of time, students came back with levels of dysregulation that, were clearly resulting in much higher levels of emergency use of restraint and seclusion. And so I think that's an important context to keep in mind. And I think it's hard to, particularly from a RESC perspective, you look at the data and it's a very large number, but it's also being reported across our entire magnet school system and across our outplacements without it being disaggregated, school to school or program to program. And so, I would just add that context when you're looking at the data.
I think one of the pieces I would want to highlight as well, and we've heard a lot of discussion amongst the legislators about the cost of outplacements, and we all know that a big part of it is our staff, and part of that is also the continual training and supervision and support that we provide our staff. When we're talking about the as an intervention, restraint and seclusion, there are clear laws around that. There's clear guidance we're reporting, and when it is an intervention that can and should be utilized. That's a continuous need for training for staff. That, we talk about quality of programming, much of that comes back to the support that we continue to provide for our staff to make sure that we are confident that they have the skills necessary to make those decisions, and how we debrief and how we talk about an incident when it happens. And I'll look to Heather, who introduced this, when I worked with her at EastConn before, one of the questions we ask still to this day is like, what could we have done differently when we debrief an incident, right? Because this is a human business. We're human and we're dealing with humans. And so sometimes we have to really ask those tough questions of ourselves of what could we have done differently? And sometimes that's about the interventions that we should be working with that student on. Sometimes it is about the adult behavior that we need to work on. And that's part of the whole equation that we need to be continuously working on and discussing as part of our professional learning for our staff.
I just want to clarify sort of something Mike said, which was, that over time, we're seeing the same students having less incidents of restraint and seclusion. You're not suggesting, are you, that kids actually learn something from being secluded or restrained?
No, I think they learn over time with consistent instruction and proper techniques how to self-regulate, how to respond to anxiety and stress in better ways, how to become better self-advocates. And that requires discrete teaching and counseling supports, therapeutic supports. I don't know that a kid necessarily would learn anything from the seclusion or from restraint other than that they don't want to have that happen. But that doesn't mean it's going to stop the behavior, because the behaviors aren't always entirely within their control in that given moment. But there's things that you can do afterwards, that trained professionals will do afterwards to help kids better be able to respond to situational stressors, their own emotions, and self-regulate.
What's your policy on calling 211 or 911 when you have a kid out of control?
And for us, it's just developed. It's a question of the acuteness of the incident, of the behavior at that moment in time. If we feel we can keep a kid safe, and if we need some outside support, but we don't necessarily need them to go to an emergency room, we'll go to 211 as a first place. If a kid's behavior is so concerning that we feel as if they're just not safe enough to be in school, we'll call for an ambulance and have an ambulance come. We do that very sparingly, and we always do that in communication with families, both 211 and 911.
And I think that's a collaborative decision. At least my experience has been across multiple sites that is a collaborative decision with administration, clinicians, and any behavioral staff that we may have involved at that point to make that decision really individual to the child and what we know about them as well.
Okay. We're here listening. We're not agreeing with you on any of this necessarily. We do have a different position particularly on seclusion, but let me move on, if that's okay, Naomi.
Yes.
Obviously, there's enormous attention in the legislature this year on the cost of outplacements, and the perception. I'm not sure how much data there is on this. The perception is that the RESC outplacements cost about the same as the private outplacements, and that the rate increases over the last few years have been as steep, in fact, a little steeper for the RESC outplacements than for the private for the APSEPs, for the approved privates. Are those perceptions inaccurate?
I think it's hard for us to say. Greg, I don't know if you want to.
Well, I was going to say the Connecticut School of Finance, Connecticut School and Municipal Finance Group did some analysis.
Right.
The average RESC per student cost is about $30,000 lower than the average private. Although I will say both had increases over 5 years of somewhere around 30 to 34%.
Right.
Which to me indicates that the driver, because most of our programs are people intensive, staff intensive. And when you look at what has happened with lower wage opportunities, with the state's focus on increasing the minimum wage, it's become more challenging to staff some of those programs. And the way to hire some of those lower paid staff is to increase that lower pay to a higher pay or to offer incentives. So I think there have been drivers, and the cost of regular education, so to speak, if you were to look at the state's per pupil cost, for all students on the Ed site, that went up 20% in that same period. So it's not that the cost of education has stayed flat and just outplacements have gone up. So
We've talked about it even from the standpoint, oftentimes we have a fair number of our staff who are in lower wage positions, entry level positions as educators, and the increase from minimum wage from 11, wherever it was 5-6 years ago, to where it is now, creates a need for us to have increased salaries. We have wage compression. And so those drivers really have been salary increases, and our efforts to also make sure we have the right staff and the quality staff that, everyone is struggling to find right now. Speech pathologists, school psychologists, special ed teachers, so there's a lot of competition to get the quality people into your programs, as our districts are struggling with that as well. So
I guess you guys have read my testimony. That's all stuff I've said as well. But there's also been this argument, and I want to know whether you see this or not, that the number and intensity of kids with behavior has just grown substantially over that period of time, and we're dealing with more difficult kids now than we were 5 years ago.
I think we see that across the board in programs, that the types of kids that are being made, the types of kids that are coming into outplacement programs have an acuity that is very different than what we would have seen 5 or 10 years ago. And many students who we would have seen in an outplacement 10 years ago are more readily maintained in district, which is great. But there's definitely a different intensity, I would say, across the board in our programs of the level of dysregulation we see in programs.
So the regulations suggest that districts need to place in RESCs before they place in APSEPs. So with the demand out there, why have your programs not grown more?
I think a major challenge, honestly, in growth of programs, because I think most of our programs have wait lists, is finding the qualified staff who want to work in highly specialized settings. And so, since COVID, the staffing shortage, which is not absent in many of the conversations that we're having at the legislative, but the solutions for it are more absent than, topics like rate setting. But, we used to have pools of people who would come in. We didn't have a teaching position. They'd start as a para, they'd move up into a teaching position, and really came in wanting to have a trajectory working with a specialized population. And we certainly, as we can see across the state, Andy, I think you had shared during the special ed task force, the kind of alarming statistics that of Central's 40 students, I think last year in the program, 39 were working in DSAP. And so we have teachers coming out of programs who are teaching before they've even finished their teaching. And so they're needing to get the training on the job. We're seeing a very different, we're just seeing a very different workforce than we saw. And so one of the most effective solutions I think we found in recent years is really strong partnerships with university programs where we can take students in earlier in their programming and hope that they want to stay because they, have a desire to work with this population of students. Things like teacher residency programs. The RESCs have a teacher residency program where we've piloted special ed teachers, and we've been able to take people in para or associate instructor positions and train them to be teachers within the setting. I think those have been effective methods, but even with those effective methods, it's still not increasing the workforce to the degree with which we'd need to see the numbers.
And of course, my concern about that is that the real shortage is in paras. And if we're teaching paras to become teachers, where's the pipeline for paras, particularly with what paras are being paid?
Yeah, and the work we're asking them to do for the money in comparison to where else they could work currently with the job market as it is for that money or more money. We routinely have paras who get injured at work because they get bit or they get kicked or hurt in other kinds of ways, and they can go work at Amazon or Stop and Shop or someplace like that and make a pretty decent hourly wage by comparison to what they're paying them. They're not going to have that same level of risk of physical injury or risk to their health. So that piece of it is a real driver for us as well too, as far as being able to expand or even take more kids than we've taken in past years.
And of course, the argument against substantially raising pay of paras is that the wage compression issue that Eric mentioned earlier, which is if you do that, you have to then raise the teacher pay,
and it drives up the cost of outplacements.
Yeah. And it's that cyclical piece of it is a real concern for us too. I mean, even on the teacher side. So as districts in our region are short special ed teachers, they will hire folks that work for us. So as someone who was a special ed teacher who worked for me for 10 years will go to one of the towns in my region, some of which are quite wealthy, and they might be on step 10 with me, and they'll offer them step 14 or step 16 at $15,000, $20,000 more per year. And, of course, the teacher is going to jump at the opportunity to make more money working in one of those towns, but it leaves me short and with no backfill because they're just not making special ed teachers anymore.
Do you guys have unions in your schools?
Yeah,
you do.
We're CEA.
Yeah, 5 out of the 6 RESCs are unionized, so we're dealing with the same bargaining unit contracts and salary increases that people are seeing in districts.
Yeah. And all the rules of collective bargaining apply to us. So when we get into contract negotiation and the town next to us gives a 3.5% raise per year over 3 years, we've got to at least match that just to stay where we are. And if we want to be competitive, we might even have to go a little bit higher than that. And back to Heather's point before, voila, now you've got a 30% increase in tuitions.
Yeah. So are you a government agency or not a government agency or somewhere in between?
No, we are a government agency, and
You
we
are
agents of in effect, of our member districts. We exist under, as I said, under statute. But we are managed in effect by a council, which is made up of our member districts. Each district sends a board member from their Board of Education to our governing council to oversee our operations.
So for a parent who's being offered a RESC placement and also looking at an APSET placement, is there a general argument that they should go with the RESC placement?
Well, if any of us said no, we'd be crazy, Andy.
I think Andy, it's a complicated answer to say what's in the best interest of the kid. I think each of us has been in a situation where we've had the referral to our program and we have said, no, we're not the best placement for that child, right? So we're not the solution for every child. Our districts know that, we know that, and sometimes we have to work hard in helping both families and districts understand that as to why we may or may not be the right placement for that child. So I don't know, it's not a one size fits all process for sure from our perspective.
Right, I think that's important, and it's true for the APSEPs as well. They all have their own specialties.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll direct this to Heather, who oversee River Street, right?
I oversee all of our special ed programming.
So River Street, a long time, very solid program for kids on the spectrum. What happens after they age out of your program? And what kind of, I guess it goes without saying that adult services are pretty weak in the state. What kind of relationships do you have with adult service providers? What kind of help do you provide for kids who are aging out of the River Street program?
Yeah, this is a real particular challenge because one of the things that we're seeing, all of our programs, and I think this would be true of all the RESC, try to have really strong relationships with DDS and or ADS depending on where the students would be being referred to. But the reality is, students coming out of River Street, many of them are going to have the highest lawn score, and finding a program that may be willing to take them, they may be few and far between. And there's a reality, and I think one of the reasons that we all get worried about rate setting, that DDS has a rate structure that does not really make it feasible to provide day services in a way that's financially sustainable. One of the things we've explored a lot because we watch this happen is how could we become a day provider so that students they may need to transition within CREC or within the RESC, but they don't have to transition out to another agency who then has to start working with them. But the reality is the reimbursement model that currently exists doesn't allow for a program to sustain it, so it has to be supported by something else. And so there needs to be work done in the state around the rates at which adult services are being paid, and that allow for the intensity of need, because it's not like the needs get any less intense when they walk out, June after they turn 22. And then you have families who have had the kind of safety and security of their K-12 education, and now there's no place for the students to go, and there's nowhere really for them to turn.
There are a lot of those kids
Yeah.
who, because of IQ levels, don't qualify for adult services.
Yeah.
So that's a whole nother issue. All the students that have the 70 IQ and don't qualify for DDS or on a many year autism waiver, and don't have anywhere to go other than to ADS for some job coaching support, which may not be sufficient to get them into competitive employment.
And I think as you see a push for transition services and where districts are engaging in some of that, again, this is one of those places where quality will look different across places. I can't say this is true of all districts, but I think and we're all out of district placements that they do this very well. But the connection to those adult services, when you begin that process and when you begin familiarizing families with what the services are, it doesn't start at 21, right? It has to start a lot earlier than that. And we see a lot of work needed in our districts to really help them understand that process. I think sometimes there's fear about what that is, and sometimes there's hesitation for families who are fearful of that transition as well. But again, starting those conversations as early as possible with families and getting their students ready for that transition is more important. I think when you talk about the students at River Street, it's a very different, levels of need, but there are many students like you're talking about, Andy, who really will require those transition services and connections with BRS and other entities that can help them make a successful transition.
Okay. Look, as you probably, I've seen you all around the legislative office building a lot. You know that up there, the word regionalization is a dirty word. There's such an antagonism to that, but you guys are the model of regionalization. That's been quite successful. Talk to me about whether more can be done in the special ed field to have districts collaborate either one-on-one or regionally, and what kind of impediments there are to doing so.
And I'm sorry, I'm just going to jump in real quickly before you give your answer. I also want to invite anyone who's watching, if they have questions that they want to start posting in the chat, to go ahead and do so. We will get to those if we have time.
From my perspective, I think there are more opportunities. It really comes down to where the districts that are in our as part of our region, where those districts want to focus their energies. We do a lot of work with districts now to try to help them build up their special ed programming, to try to reduce the number of kids in their self-contained programs, try to keep more kids in district. And certainly, when we look at regionalizing programs, I mean, there's the easy things would be to find a space, set up a program on a border between a couple of towns and run special ed programs for them, where they get to share in the resources of a single place, right? But the real complicated part of this is what I just talked about. The hard work is trying to capitalize on our expertise and have kids stay within their own district so that they're in their own communities. They're really looking at their home district as LRE first. But that means building teacher quality, it means building expertise, and it means helping those districts get some in-district support that they don't currently have.
And, Andy, I think as RESCs, we're well poised to be assisting with some of those regional efforts. But it's the willingness and the upfront cost that comes with that. We all know that when you want to start a program, you could have districts who want to do that and understand that they'd be able to bring students back that might be much further from home. But there is an upfront cost that's associated with that. And there's a period of time before a program can become self-sustaining. And in difficult budget times, even though people understand that reality, it's a hard sell when you are trying to kind of land a district budget to say we need to invest in bringing students back, whether it's with a RESC or whether it's internally in the district for something that a Board of Ed might see 4 years from now or 3 years from now.
It's staffing wise and space wise. I mean, it's a multi-year commitment to space and time when a lot of districts are short on space and they don't have the money to bond to start to build new facilities or add on to schools.
True. And then I look at the EastConn region, and the distance between towns is, so enormous that doing anything, regionally is really a problem. Right, Eric?
It is, and yet there still is that opportunity, right? To be looking at smaller regional space, doesn't necessarily work sort of on the county of northeastern Connecticut, but you can take a couple of districts who are neighbors, and help them create a program that's regional that supports students. All of our families are used to longer periods of transportation, right? So, students in Hampton or Eastford are already used to long periods of transportation just because of the geographic area that they're covering. So, it's not that we want to have students on a bus for, extended periods of time, but it isn't necessarily that dramatically different for them to go to Union or to go to Stafford in some cases. So, we're trying to have those conversations with districts to say, who has the space, who has the desire and the willingness to do that, and really that shared services model where we can support them, because it is expensive in creating the programs. And as Mike said, you do have to make sure that you're doing this in a quality way. You want to have the right space that's appropriate for the students, and you want to have the right approach by the staff that they're going to be interacting with. Having a program where students, if it's really about access to the least restrictive environment, you want an environment where those students can actually get into that environment and be supported as well.
Now, you have a program in Killingly High School, right?
We do. We're in the old high school. We're actually we'll be exiting that location at the end of this school year.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought you were in the new high school. No?
No, we're in the former high school.
And so there is no opportunity for contact with non-disabled peers.
Correct.
Okay, but it is a program where kids from various towns come to, right?
That's correct. Yep. Yeah, we have, I think we have like 22 different towns that send to that program.
And in that case, Killingly is just your landlord, basically. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. No, it's not their program in any way.
No.
Okay, and I assume that that CREC has programs like that as well.
Is probably the longest standing kind of regional effort that we could point to would be Farmington Valley Diagnostic Center. It's been around for 25 plus years. It's a program that was started by the Educational Resource Collaborative in Farmington Valley. It's operated by CREC but owned by the districts, and it's a membership model where districts choose to purchase between 1 to 4 seats, and they can use that for they're basically buying a number of days. And so they can use that for one or several students, whether it's for a short-term diagnostic placement or whether that's for the period of 1 year. We try not to have students that stay much longer than a year. It's intended to be a short-term placement, really aimed at kind of stabilization and getting students back to district, or to, if they require a more restrictive environment, to a more restrictive environment.
That's a model we point to a lot, and I know in the conversation that's, kind of in the legislature right now of trying to create, a grant program with seed money. That really the most effective way to do that would be to look at some of the models that we've run, because, if every district tries to create that similar program, that money is not going to go very far. And if, as Heather pointed out, the Farmington Valley model is a perfect example of cooperation with our member districts. It's their program, and we just run it, and it's been very successful. And that's the kind of thing I'd love to see us be able to replicate on behalf of districts across the state.
And Andy, just to a question you were talking about before, and Greg spoke about the RESC Alliance. That is sort of the space we've been talking a lot about in terms of special education, and where each of us has our strengths and our capacities, we can develop programs. And if we don't, we would lean on one of our partner RESCs to bring somebody in with expertise to help a district do that, whether that, even if it's in our own catchment area. So we've had a lot of conversations around our effort and desire to be in that space to support our districts.
And is there resistance from the districts?
No, I think the resistance is funding, being able to have the necessary resources to initiate the program.
Okay, we're gonna have to wrap this up, but let me, it occurs to me that in education, nothing is stable. I mean, how many math curriculums have we had in the last 20 years? I mean, and one of the problems is, I keep on hearing from superintendents, is when I was in this district, I started this terrific program, and then my successor terminated it. And we just can't invest money in programs that don't have any long shelf life. I think that's a real concern in the whole process.
It is.
And I think to that point, Andy, it's one of the reasons that RESCs were created and that we're here for. We are stable. A lot of us have programs that have been around for 50 or 60 years, and there's a reason behind that. And we really, we feel very strongly about being here to support the member districts and having placements for students where they can come either for a period of time or for a longer period of time if that's what they need, and then help in development of a continuum of services to get those students back into their districts. Because we don't want students sitting in outplacements for many years if they don't need to be doing that.
Let me combine our traditional final question with a question from somebody who wrote in. The question that wrote in is, what's the future of the RESCs? But our general final question is, tell me something that gives you hope in this process. And you can answer both of those together, or one or the other, and let's go around and do each one. And I'm going to start with Mike McGrath.
Well, and the future, I think, is we have to continue to be flexible. Like you just mentioned, 5 math curriculums probably in the past 7 years. But the reality is that our responsibility is to continue to be flexible and try to be predictive and just meet the needs of our groups, of our regional partners. In terms of what gives me hope is I got into this business because I really liked working with kids. I'm lucky that I have an office that's in a place where we have a school, so I get to see kids, and teachers and professionals do really great work with kids. And as long as we continue to have those opportunities for kids to learn from high quality professionals and people who care and are dedicated to do their work, that gives me hope.
Eric, your turn.
Yeah, I would agree a lot with what Mike said. I think the future of the RESCs, we have always been adaptable. And so where we will be in 5 or 10 years, it will be largely driven by the needs of our communities that we serve. I'll say at EastConn, we are really also recognizing that our role is not just with our districts, but really truly with our communities. And we see a number of our families who have struggled for a number of years and generationally. And so being in a position to help, that blends into my degree of hope. I believe that we're here, each of us has a set of gifts and resources and therefore an obligation to give back. And I love having conversations with people who have that same mindset. And that gives me hope that the world is going to be a good place and some place that I want my kids to be in, because there are enough people still in this world who care about others. And that's certainly what drives me every day.
And Heather?
Yeah, again, I would agree with what Mike and Eric said, in terms of, I think we will continue to adapt into what we need to be to meet the needs of our students in our districts. But in terms of what gives me hope, like there's so much noise out there right now about all the bad things that are happening. But when you walk into one of our programs or to a school and you see that the kids that we serve, it very quickly brings you back to why we do this. And even at, something as simple as the, public hearing on Monday, hearing the amount of people that come out to advocate for students with disabilities and making sure students with disabilities have their rights supported gives me hope that, we'll all continue to do this work, working for the needs of kids.
Thank you. And Dr. Florio.
Well, I'm going to echo a little bit of what's been said, but I'll just share that, RESCs began in the 1960s. And one of the things that they did was they were the repository for film strips and 16 millimeter movies.
Okay.
They basically were the library for their districts and would deliver them as needed. So RESCs are definitely adaptable because we don't do that anymore because needs change and we adapt. And as we see a need, whether it's maybe AI in education now, we're going to gear up to support our districts, to support the state in addressing those issues. And what gives me hope, and Andy, as you said, we've spent a lot of time in the legislative office building and in meetings, and we sit there with a lot of groups who have a lot of initials connected to them, CREC, RESCs, and many, many others. And we're not always on the same side of an issue or the same side of the table when we're having discussions, but we're all here to do what's right for children. And I think as long as public educators continue to feel that that's the main reason we're here and we support education, then I have no reason to give up hope.
Well, that's the fact that you don't have any reason to give up hope is a reason for me to have hope. I thank you all.
Thank you all so much tonight for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do I end this now? I'm not sure.
Can you stop the recording? You don't